All right. Welcome to the Successfully Unemployed podcast. I'm your host, Roger Wesley, and I'm absolutely thrilled for you because today we have an absolutely amazing person on the show today. Today we have Dr. Axel Meierhoefer, who is an Air Force veteran turned real estate investor. He uses strategies like 1031 exchange, turnkey, and more. Axel now owns multiple properties in different countries and states, such as Ohio, Idaho, Florida, Spain, Panama, and more. He currently educates and empowers others through the Ideal Wealth Grower and hosts the Ideal Investor Show. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Axel Meierhoefer. Thanks for being on the show today.
Thank you, Roger. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So tell us, how did you get here? I mean, with an amazing intro like that, you have lived a life, many exciting men. So how did you do all this? How did you do all these things?
Well, that's a good question. It feels a little bit like it. I originally wanted to fly for the airlines, but I came out of school when there was a recession. So they said, well, we can test you, but we cannot guarantee you a job. And the military said we can always use a few good men, if you know that movie. So I applied for the airlines, tested. They said all good, but currently no training. Then applied for the Air Force, and they said, yep, good to go. And so I did the Air Force thing for 22 years. Got to see the world, as they say, right? Like I went to all the different countries in Europe and then ultimately got into flight testing, and that took me to the US, and then actually got a chance to fly for the US Air Force for a couple of years. And at the end of that career, one of the things I was responsible for was to establish a flight training center on a US Air Force base. And for that operation, we wanted to have software that could actually help us organize all of that stuff. And the owner of a software company from Santa Barbara said, did I hear this right, that you're going to retire? I said, yep, that's true. And he said, want a job? And I said, yeah, I would love to, but I need a green card and work permit and house and all that stuff. And he said, yeah, we can make that happen. I'm like, really? Okay. And he kept his word. He made it happen. So I became a executive in a software company for 5 years. And then I decided I wanted to see if I could also make it on my own without thinking, okay, now I have no retirement plan anymore. And that's what got me into real estate, initially completely just for our family. Never really had at the time any ambition that that would turn into a business, but I'm a blabbermouth. That's why I have a podcast, right? And so I told people about the different endeavors and the learnings and the successes and failures and so forth. And more kept asking, hey, is that something I could do as well? I always thought it's only for rich people and blah, blah, blah. And so, yeah, I said, yeah, I can help you, until my wife said, hey, you're spending all these hours and hours and hours for free. Don't you think you should charge something for that? And Ideal Wealth Grower was born, and we have a mentoring program. And then somebody said, well, if you want to expand your network of services, one really cool way is to invite experts in your industry to your show. And if it turns out that they do something that you don't, but that your clients could benefit from, then you start a relationship with them. And so I have now I always say, a big wheel. In the middle, in the center, is our mentoring program. And all around it, the number of spokes is constantly getting more and more of people that, we have people that help us with land trust, with lending, with inspections, with property management, and on and on and on and on.
Wow.
And I'm pretty proud, besides the program itself, that we have all these good, trusting relationships. So that's basically how I got here.
Wow. So tell me, you said you're married. Do you have any children?
We have one child, yes.
That's awesome. How old?
37.
Get out of here. That's amazing. So when you were starting your real estate journey, what was the driving factor? Was it having that child and being able to spend more time with them, or what was the driving factor for you to be able to create more income outside of what you had earned through working in the military?
Well, the initial factor was that when I stopped, or my career ended in the military, it was 2002. If anybody remembers, historically, 2003 was the big dot-com crash in the stock market. And I got hired basically in 2002, worked for about 4 years. And then in 2005, I started my own business, and then kind of transitioned out of the software company into my own business. And this whole stock market crash was still fresh in my memory. So I'm like, okay, I don't think I want to do stocks for like the long term. What else could I do? And I really started looking, okay, what do other successful people do? And I always tell this story. I know people always chuckle a little bit, but at the time, one of the most well-known names, like right now, if you were to say, who have you heard that is a celebrity? A lot of people would probably say something like Donald Trump or Elon Musk or people like that. Well, at that time, when I was kind of looking for who very well-known people was Arnold Schwarzenegger, because all the Terminator movies were like, big things. And there was a little bit, I know this is a super, super long stretch, so bear with me, right? But he's from Austria, I'm from Germany. He went through all kinds of iterations to ultimately become an actor, right? Like he wasn't an actor right away. And so I started looking a little bit like, what does somebody like him do, even though I was like an ant and he was the elephant in comparison. But what I found out, interestingly enough, is that unbeknownst to a lot of people, he had developed a pretty sizable residential real estate portfolio in California from the money he made with the movies. And I thought, wow, that's pretty cool. Let me look into this. And then, the old story, you get cassette tapes and then you get DVDs and then you do workshops and stuff. And you learn more and more. And what I learned from it is he could do it in California because he had what I call bullshit money, right? Like he had so much of all kinds. I didn't have that. And we were living in the Santa Barbara area. And I'm like, okay, well, I can't do it here. What would actually work if you just look at the principle of investing? And I thought, okay, well, if I were to find a property, let's say for $100,000, now you have to keep in mind this was like 2013, 14 timeframes. So there were plenty of properties like that. I only would really have to pay 20, 25,000 down. I could be the owner of a property. But they didn't exist in California, obviously. So that's where the whole thing started to say, okay, well, where are these locations where I can find these properties? And what would I need to do as a regular person with reasonable means to make that work? And luckily, sometimes the universe is helping, right? So the universe said, oh, Axel needs help. Let's give him help. There's this guy named Chris Closure, who is one of the sons of a company that at the time was called Memphis Invest. And they were and still a turnkey provider in Memphis. And he wrote the book, how his family turned or made turnkey investing successful. If anybody listening in your audience interested, if you now want to figure out what became of them, you can Google REI Nation, so Real Estate Investing Nation.
Oh, wow. That's them?
REI Nation is basically the now nationwide or almost nationwide company that originally started in Memphis. And Chris wrote a book called Turnkey Revolution. And that book basically describes almost like a checklist. What do you need to do and pay attention to if you want to be a turnkey investor? And so I don't even remember how I found out about it, but I got that book, I read that book, and I said, that's it. My $100,000 house can be anywhere as long as I find a turnkey provider that meets all the criteria that Chris wrote about.
Wow.
Well, that's what I did. That's what I looked for. That's what I found, started investing and have been doing ever since. Not initially just for myself, and now obviously also for the clients.
Wow, that's amazing. I mean, there's so much in that soundbite that we could unpack, but I mean, let's go back to Arnold Schwarzenegger. I mean, how did you come across his real estate portfolio? I didn't know that he had real estate. I mean, I grew up watching him in that Terminator time period. I mean, I saw all those movies. I remember, I'll be back, putting the thumb up through the lava for those that could see me on video. I mean, that was epic during that time period. But how in the world did you rub shoulders with him? And then if you could.
No.
Okay.
What I did is basically I asked myself, now keep in mind, I was living in the Santa Barbara area. And so we weren't very far from Hollywood and very far from the San Francisco area. And I just asked somebody like that had multiple careers to get to the level of fame that he is at, what is he actually doing with the money? Right. And so I started looking, and at the time that wasn't really as prevalent that you say Google it, but you had to kind of do like a little bit more traditional research and certain newspaper articles. And yes, you could Google obviously in 2005 and 6 and 10, where there were articles and reports that Arnold had bought another like apartment building in Santa Monica, or had bought something close to San Francisco and so forth. And so, I basically found out, obviously, one of the things that he seems to be doing is taking a pretty pretty chunk of the money he makes from the movies and invest it in real estate. And see, for me, that was only to say, okay, this is somebody with kind of like a regular person background. If you read his autobiography, which by the way, I recommend for anybody, he doesn't come from rich families or stuff. His parents were living through the war. His dad was a soldier and stuff, nothing fancy, nothing to do with bodybuilding either, by the way. And so for me, this was, okay, here's somebody that I can relate to, immigrant in a way to the United States, was successful, decided to put substantial money in real estate. Let me look into this a little more. And I mean, anybody, I know your story with Dustin and stuff. When somebody puts you on a topic, then you can go and say, well, what books can I find? What kind of videos can I find? What is the at the time TV saying about it? And so I started just really researching what's so interesting about real estate, because I only knew real estate as a residence. If you had enough money, you were trying to get a house to live in. I mean, it sounds probably a little weird, but I didn't realize that individual people would own like a whole apartment complex. From Germany, it's companies, like whole big development companies who own apartment complexes. I had no concept that a normal person like you and I, Roger, would be able to own stuff like that. Well, and then I heard Arnold did it, and then I found out some even way more regular people did it. And then I realized, okay, this concept of turnkey, for me at least, that was the key.
Wow.
You can be living anywhere, however expensive, if you have a way to get to properties and outsource all the necessary services that come with owning a property. And that's what turnkey investing is. You outsource everything.
Wow. So do you still remember the very first property that you picked up?
Yes.
Can you take us back to how you felt right before you bought it and kind of the thoughts that were racing through your mind, how you got the income? I mean, did you save up for a long time, or what was that process to get that very first property?
Well, like I said, it was a little bit of a godsend to have that book, and I read that book, and it's one of those books, I don't know if you or your audience has those, where you have all these little stickies on the side and all kinds of writing in between the paragraphs and stuff. That's kind of how that thing started looking like pretty quickly. And so when I got into the point of wanting to invest, I had learned something that I'm still preaching to today. The first thing, even before looking at the property, was to find out, is the provider covering all three most important bases? And those three most important bases, did they pay attention when they looked for the property that they will ultimately sell to an investor like me? So this old saying, you have heard this, everybody has heard, location, location, location. Well, how does this apply for turnkey investing? Is, I always call it finding the ugly duckling, the neglected property in a nice neighborhood, and get it for as cheap as you can. That's the first really important thing, because anybody can find a neglected property to renovate, but if it's somewhere out to where nobody wants to be, it's really hard to rent it, right? So it needs to be in a nice neighborhood where people want to live so that you can rent it for a pretty penny. Then the second of the three main core bases is to say, has the company understood that if they overprice it, an investor wouldn't buy it? Which is basically the balance between how much did they pay, how much did the renovation cost, and how much does it appraise for? Because if it doesn't appraise, this, anybody who does real estate investing knows, if the appraiser says it's worth 100,000 and the seller wants 120,000, the bank is only going to give you the loan or the mortgage for however the appraiser says. So the company needs to know their market well enough to say, we cannot over renovate it, right? If it's in a, like, let's say a C plus B minus neighborhood and you put golden faucets and granite countertops and stuff, then your sales price goes way over what the area bears, what the tenants can afford, but also what the price of the house is going to be. So that's the second thing. I call that the sales and marketing department of that turnkey provider. They need to know their market really well. And then the third component is, how well organized is their property management division? Because a really good, far away from home turnkey provider needs to have all three of those. Because like I just said, you outsource everything. So if you outsource property management, again, they need to know their market, but not for selling, but they're for renting. How do they vet people? What do they do in background checks? How do they inspect the properties? How do they actually inform you? Do they have like some sort of online system where both the tenant, the turnkey provider, and you as the owner can constantly look in and see what's happening with my properties, right? And so if they meet those three main pillars, so to speak, or main aspects, then they're a good provider. And then you can say, okay, now show me what properties you have on offer. And what you want to see, and nowadays when we do this with our clients, is we look at what they offer, we look at what their claims are. Let's take this, it's just for calculation. I'm not claiming that there are a lot of $100,000 properties, but it just makes an easy calculation to say, okay, they have a $100,000 property, we can get financing 80% from the bank, $20,000 from ourselves. What are they saying the rent can be? If they say on claim the rent can be $850 today, we go either on deal check or rent to me and check, put in the address and say what is common in the market, what has rented recently. They look about a 1 mile radius, similar property. If everything rents for $750, then you know they're over promising you on rent. If everything rents for $950 and they say between $800 and $900, you know, okay, they're in the right ballpark. Then you run your numbers through like a calculator. I, for example, love the one at Bigger Pockets that puts all the numbers in and tells you how much cash flow you're going to make. Right. So my number one thing to say, when would I even look at something, assuming the provider is good, is when it's pretty close to the 1% rule. So $100,000 property, about $1,000 rent, 150,000, 1,500 rent, 200,000, about 1,900, 2,000 rent. So that's basically the starting point. And then you look at all the other things. And what you end up doing is you basically vetting the turnkey provider and the property together, right? And so even on top of that, we recommend, I have always done it with every property, to do an inspection. The appraiser gives you obviously confirmation if the sales price is correct. That also makes financing typically pretty easy. And then if we talk, and the cherry on the icing of that really nice cake is, when you're working with the team, like our clients, when they work with me, I'm a big fan of what's called clustering. The idea being, let's say we identified Columbus, Ohio as an interesting market, and we have a turnkey provider who provides and works in Columbus, Ohio. If I buy one and you buy one and Johnny buys one, and we don't know of each other and have never done anything together, for the provider, we are 3 individual investors, and that's how we're being treated. Take the other example. I have already bought 3 from them, and 3 of my other clients each bought 2. Now we have a portfolio of 9 or 10 properties that all came through my referral. If yours or Johnny's or my property have any issue and I call them, I'm not the person with 1 property. I'm the person that represents 9 or 10, and they treat you accordingly. That's the strength that you have when you build long-term relationships. And clustering also means, why would you want to have one single property in 10 different markets? What does that mean? That's just the last point in this whole game, is basically to say, if I take myself serious as an investor, then there is a certain aspect of efficiency that I want to look at. So how is that with me? For my portfolio, I have 3 clusters. That means once a month for 20 minutes, I talk to each one of those turnkey providers. And within about an hour, hour and a half, I know what my whole portfolio has done in a month. If I had 10 different turnkey providers in 10 different locations, let's say I do the same 20 minutes, right? Then I have to talk to 3 hours on different property managers for each of them. Same thing with the systems, right? I have 3. 2 of them use AppFolio. So all I need to know is AppFolio, and the other one is Buildium. How to log in, look at what I see, then have the call done. Hour and a half per month, basically. That's what I mean by outsourcing.
And that's what you used, like when you first got into it. Are these systems that you built over time?
Well, I mean, like there are software services like AppFolio, for example, is probably one of the most used property management software services that especially larger operations use. And they have a login for the owner, a login for the tenant, and a login for the company, right? But if you have 5 properties with the same organization and have the same software, then you only really need to look at one report for 5 houses instead of 5 individual ones in 5 different locations. So the clustering helps you to be efficient, gives you a little bit more negotiation power, and it saves you time because you don't have to talk to so many people.
Very nice. So then tell me this, I think that sometimes real estate is this big pie in the sky type of investment. Can you bring it down to earth? Help us to understand, what are some of the lifestyle things that you've been able to do because you invested in real estate? What are some of the things that you've been able to do? In fact, I believe that when I interviewed on your podcast here recently, I believe you was in another country. I mean, can you tell us a little bit about what you've been able to do as a result of your investing?
Well, we have something that we call the time freedom point. That is kind of the starting point. So what does that mean? It means basically when you ask yourself, Roger, what is my lifestyle in a somewhat idealized way? How much do I want to spend on food, on my car, on my vacations, on my little toys and whatever. So you have for you and your family a certain lifestyle that you either have or like to have. Other people have theirs, I have mine. So when you convert that on what do I need to make on an average per month to afford that lifestyle, that gives you what I call the time freedom point number. So let's just say, for sake of argument, my number was $6,000 a month. Now, on the investing side, it tells me exactly how many investments do I need to make and how much cash flow do they have to produce so that I have those $6,000 a month. When I go to your question, what does that mean for my lifestyle? That means, for example, when somebody says, okay, I would be interested to get mentorship from you. And we do a complimentary call, typically about an hour or so. We get to know each other in the call, and I don't feel it. Like, I don't feel that you and I, we met and we knew immediately we kind of like each other. We are on the same wavelengths, but it's not with everybody. Right? I basically sometimes use the analogy, if I'm a fan of classic music and I meet somebody who is constantly running heavy metal, we're probably not going to come on the same thing, So what I'm looking for, and this is a luxury that you have when you reach above and beyond, or at least to the time freedom point, is you can decide what do you want to spend your time on. That's the freedom to spend your time. That's why it's called the time freedom. So one thing is, number one, I only do stuff I can do online, kind of what we're doing right now, right? I could be in San Diego, but I could also be in Spain or could be anywhere as long as I have internet. And luckily, Mr. Musk is making it so that we will have that everywhere on the globe in the future. Most places you already have it. So internet is the only thing that I need. And other than that, when you know that you have the income coming in from your investments, yes, you still need to spend that hour and a half per month to make sure everything is in place and working properly. That's your role as the business owner, right? Like, I always say this for the audience. If you adopt in your mind that you are the king of your empire, you're the owner of your business, like in any other business, the owner is giving the direction and the vision. And those who actually have a benefit, meaning like a salary, or they get paid, or they have a fee, like our property management gets 10% of the rent. Well, I have a reasonable expectation that they perform, right? So just as a little side note, so, like with that, I'm constantly checking, is my business doing what its purpose is, providing the cash flow to allow for my lifestyle. And then what it allows me is to be where I want to be. And very important point, deep concept, in my opinion, is to ask yourself, who do I want to work with? If you're working for somebody and the company says, hey, Frankie is your new co-worker, or like how many movies have we seen where, some police thing and they get a new partner, and most of the time then they don't like each other from the get-go or whatever, right? Like, so in our case, in my case, or anybody in our community, if you reach the time freedom point, you decide who you want to work with or not. You decide where you want to be or not. You decide how much you want to spend on anything or not. You decide where you want to add or use any time or not. I love doing podcasts. That's why I enjoy and grateful that you invited me. Right? But if for some reason, whatever might happen, that this kind of wears out and it's not fun anymore, I could anytime say, no, I'm not doing it anymore. That's a luxury to have. And that's what the investments afford me to do, and anybody else who is in our system, where you can say, no matter what happens, shelter, this is Maslow's pyramid of needs kind of thing. People will always need security, food, and shelter, right? So I did security for 22 years. And the last 20 years, I'm doing shelter. I don't think that people are going to go back into caves, right? So as long as they want to live in a nice place, and I have 10 nice little places that I invite people for fair treatment and fair payment to live in, we're all good.
Wow. Wow, I love that. So then where do you split your time? You mentioned Spain. Do you travel to Spain, or where do you like to spend the most time in the world? Where's your favorite place to live?
Well, I would basically say it's about 50-50 between the San Diego area and Spain. And it's kind of a little bit, it's not necessarily funny, but if you ask yourself, why did we pick Spain as a retirement location? Well, we were looking around the Mediterranean to find a place where the climate and the plants and everything is as similar to San Diego as possible. And so we found that area in Spain between Valencia and Alicante that is literally, I mean, if anybody came here, blindfolded and you open up, the only thing they would say, where do all these old, historic buildings come from? But other than that, everything is the same,
Wow.
So that's what we were looking for. And the other thing that we also admittedly were looking for is how much further our time freedom point money take us. And in Spain, cost of living, normal stuff that anybody does is about 40% less than San Diego. So, you could theoretically argue that we could have gotten to our time freedom point sooner had we gone to Spain sooner. But, now it's actually nicer because we met the time freedom point for San Diego. And, when we're in Spain, it's just icing on the cake.
Wow. So then tell us because I'm guessing that most of our listeners are here in the United States but help me understand, if you were in Spain, what's something that a tourist wouldn't be able to find that you've been able to find and enjoy now that you're a resident?
Well, one thing that a tourist couldn't do is have, for my family, all of it, private insurance for $350 a month.
What?
So you as a tourist, you're a tourist, right? You have your thing, whatever you have, but you won't have, that would be one example. Or another thing is for the house that we own in Spain, the property taxes. A house that in San Diego would probably cost about $1 million. Now it doesn't cost that in Spain, admittedly, it costs about $350. But instead of me telling you, what do you think the property tax is per year?
Maybe $5,000.
Okay, that would actually be half of what it is in San Diego, but it's actually $896.
In Spain for a year?
Yeah,
Oh,
$6.
I think you're going to sell my listeners on going and moving to Spain, reconsidering having some.
But the point is not Spain per se. It's looking around and for us, it was obviously first to say we want another location that is very similar in climate and otherwise in culture and so forth to San Diego. But the other point was also, which not everybody has, we still have family in Germany. Now they're all threatening to come to Spain because we are here, not so far away anymore, right? Which is fine, no problem, especially for my mom. I would love if I could convince her to do that. But so there were a couple of other things, but one for like looking a little bit into the future and to say, how can we stretch further this time freedom point money that we have is obviously to live in a place that is just as nice and cost less. That's why we did start to do the international investments. The other thing, and I don't want to go political or anything like that, but it's one quite stark thing that we felt pretty quickly after coming to Spain is that you feel so much safer.
Really?
And it's not something where I could say I put my finger on or that I felt threatened or anything when we are in San Diego. It's just more, that when you meet a cop, how they look like and what they have with them, right? They don't look like a SWAT team member that is ready to go to war, for example. And those little things, those are little visual cues. That's for example, this feeling of safety, this knowledge that nobody can just easily get a gun and those kind of things, those make a difference too. And this is not just Spain or Europe, like you mentioned, we have some investments in Belize and in Panama and so forth. And that's a lot of places around the world that just don't allow their public to be armed like crazy, And yeah, I understand the Second Amendment and the intention. I just don't see that anybody that has arms and weapons is really part of a militia, so that's maybe my interpretation.
Wow. I mean, for the sake of conversation, I mean, I think it's amazing to be able to go to have properties in different parts of the world. I mean, to branch outside of the United States to invest in countries like Belize and Panama and Spain. That's amazing. So, let me ask you this, as you were starting to broach those topics, were there some pivotal books outside of the one from the gentleman, Mr. Chris from REI Nation, that you would suggest that maybe we look into reading or learning a little bit more about how we can do the same thing?
Well, there are a couple of books, and they're not all necessarily related to investing or to real estate. And I'm a big believer that you, over time, as you grow as an individual, you're well advised to start building and developing your worldview, right? Like, so anybody listening to us right now, I would encourage to say, okay, what do you see if you expand your horizon? Where is the world going to be in 5 years, in 10 years, in 20 years? Right, and that can be technology, that can be societal, that can be political, that can be all kinds of things. So one book that I would, for example, recommend if you want to look a little bit or in that direction of where are we going, there's a very recent book in March this year from Tony Seba, and the title of the book is Stellar, right? Like the stars, Stellar. And it talks basically about the coming age of abundance, but not like the movie The Secret, but really based on technology. Why is the evolution of technology bringing the age of abundance? That's one direction to go. And if you want to see the counterbalance for that argument about the age of abundance, there are two books. One is called The Fourth Turning, which was written in the late 90s. And it basically describes that humanity, especially in the Western world, goes through generational waves or cycles, each cycle being about 25 to 30 years. So it started like after World War II, we gotten into this kind of massive building cycle all over in the Western world, whether it's in Europe or the United States. The socialists came back, everybody started rebuilding. Then you get basically in the next generation cycle, and that is where you're still building, but you're starting to have systems. That was kind of like in the 60s, baby boomers, everybody made babies, right? Because you were coming out of the economic downturn. Then the next cycle is basically kind of getting into the 90s, was where you start harvesting, right? You have been building anywhere between 30 and 50 years, build the economy, build systems, build housing, build factories. You start harvesting. And now where we're getting basically in the like 2019, 2020, and now what we're living in is the cycle like in any kind of system where when you're done harvesting, you have to rest to restart. Now, in the past, if you go historically, that resting and restart was always wars. And yes, I know there are some wars going on, but not really in Europe. Well, Ukraine is borderline, right? But in general, for what we consider the Western world, we don't really have shooting wars, but still the cycles apply. And so if we are actually asking ourselves, well, if we are in this fourth cycle, fourth part, what does it mean? And it leads perfectly into the stellar thing, because you and I and everybody and their grandmother knows that we have AI coming in every which way. AI is basically the new industrial revolution, right? And that is, we are in the cycle where everything gets disrupted so that we can get in this new spring, I don't know, 2028 or 2030, whenever it's going to start, hopefully without a war, where we get into a building phase again, this time with AI. So that's the fourth turning. A similar thing, by the way, Ray Dalio wrote a great book about changing world principles. I'm not quite sure exactly about, but that's the last book he's writing about the same thing. So those are things that all go into what's coming, what's in the future. The other thing that I personally like, because it's also my hobby, is the book The Wealthy Gardener by John Soforic. And that basically was written by John because he wanted to leave something for his son to think about money, to think about investing, to think about why would you do business with a certain type of person and not another type of person. And so that has a lot of really nice little digestible lessons in it that I definitely recommend for people who say, okay, well, how do I approach this whole universe of investing from a regular person's starting point?
Wow.
And then there are plenty other books, like The Millionaire Next Door is a great book. Most of them, the second batch that I mentioned, have to do with how do you actually position yourself in this world? And that's why I mentioned earlier, I think it's extremely important. And for our mentoring clients, that's one of the very first things that I do with them in the sessions is, I want you to start to learn that you are the king or the queen of your empire, and your role is the creator of your own future. That's the overarching thing that we do. The other stuff, what do we invest? How do we invest? How much cash flow? Who do we outsource? All that is basically the path. But where are we going is for you to become the king or queen of your own empire and the creator of your own future.
Wow.
And that's
Wow,
a mindset thing. If you don't adopt that mindset, that is something that you want to do, then you're better off going to whoever is employing you and do what they want. But if you want to do something for yourself, you want to create your own future, and you can imagine how you like it to look like, and you can make all the decisions that get you there. You ask me, how is that with having reached the time freedom point? My future was, I want to decide who I work with. I want to decide whose podcast I go on. I want to decide where I spend a few months in the year, here or there. Well, normally most people can't because the finances are not allowing for that, right? So I first created the investments, which created the future that we're living now.
Wow. Wow. Thank you for sharing that. I love that. Dr. Axel, I tell you, there's been so many wonderful nuggets that you shared here, so many great book recommendations, so many wonderful things. I have to ask you, Dr. Axel, before we wrap up here, how can people get in touch with you? How can they find you? I mean, whether you're in Spain, whether you're in Belize, whether you're in San Diego, how can people get in touch with you? How can they learn a little bit more about your process and how you've been able to create the wealth and how you've been able to invest?
Well, the easiest is you can use Google and just put in ideal wealth grower, and you end up on our website or all over the place. Just those three words, either together or separate, gets you to all the online stuff. And if you go to our website, it has the little button that says book a call, and it's complimentary, doesn't cost you anything. If you have questions based on what we talked about today, or just in general, or you want to know what the mentoring program is, or any like that, that's why I love to talk to people and find out, like we said, this whole thing about the right vibe. I love to talk to people and work with people where we have that common connection. And to find out, the only way that I found is talk to each other.
Absolutely. Wow. Well, I tell you what, this has been an absolutely amazing conversation. And I'm personally going to go back and listen to this episode a couple of times because I heard some good things in there. I need to figure out this $896 property tax piece that you shared about Spain. It might be time for me to go to Spain and make some adjustments. But at any rate, Dr. Axel, thank you so much for coming on to the show today. We truly appreciate it. And any final words for our listeners today before we let you go?
Yeah, I would probably say in one sentence, ask yourself, how much do you decide about your life right now on your own free decision, and how much is basically decided by others? And if you don't like that ratio, change it.
Wow. Mic drop moment. Boom. Wow. Thanks so much for coming on to the show.
You're welcome. Thank you, Roger.